Thank you for joining this panel discussion. I'm going to briefly introduce the panel and the subjects we'll be talking, and then we could just move into the discussion. So my name is Laurent. I'm a Lebanese student here at King's, and I'm a second year PPL student. And I'm also the president of the Human Rights Project at the KCL Pro Bono Society. And I'll be one of the moderators today. In this panel, we will aim to discuss the main issues faced by the queer community in the MENA region. Mainly, we'll be talking about different things such as criminalization, pinkwashing policies, queer activism, but also reform amid the recent protests, both in Lebanon and across the region. So we're joined today by Tia Shami. She's the co-founder of our partnering NGO for this panel, which is Ma3kon, and she'll be talking a bit more about Ma3kon later on. And our three speakers, thank you so much for joining. Robert Wintemute and Sinine Nakhle and Margot El Khoury. Maybe we could do a brief round of introduction. So Robert, if you want to introduce yourself quickly.
Okay. The gray beard tells you that I have a lot of experience in this area. I grew up in Calgary in Western Canada, studied law at McGill University in Montreal, practiced law in New York, moved to Oxford to do my Ph.D. and came to King's to start teaching in 1991. So I was in the UK for Section 28, etc. I saw the bad years in the UK, so I've seen how it can get better. So that helps when considering the situation in other countries.
Yeah, thank you so much. Margot, if you want to go next.
My name is Margot El Khoury. I'm a genderqueer activist currently working with Helem. Grew up in Saudi Arabia. Joined Lebanon a couple of years ago. This is when I started, exploring a little bit more my gender and my sexuality. And this is when I started partaking in multiple initiatives and organizations for LGBTQI plus rights and also women's rights. So I'm pleased to be with you here today. Thank you for the invitation. I am the community center manager at Helem at the moment. So I coordinate and keep an eye on our safe space, our community center safe space, and all the programs and projects that our clubs and committees come up with.
Yeah, thank you so much. And lastly, Sinine, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Laurent, for the invitation. So my name is Sinine Nakhle. I'm currently pursuing my Ph.D. at the University of Amsterdam in media studies, where I'm studying the aesthetic activist practices that were used during the 2019 protest in Lebanon. Before that, I had done my master's at the American University of Beirut in psychology. And when I told my very first story about coming out and joined the collective Damme, back then I decided to completely shift careers and invest a bit more in literature and media. And that's when I pursued my second MA in Leiden University. And after that, I joined UvA. And I can tell you maybe more about my experiences later, and when I kind of like relate them to what I do, which is basically I do comics, right? I'm a cartoon artist, and I created the page Beirut by Dyke in 2018 to tell my own experiences around what it was like for me to grow up queer in Beirut.
Thank you so much for that. So yeah, before we move into the official discussion, I think it's useful to talk a bit about our partnering NGO and the fundraising we're doing alongside this event. So Tia, if you want to go ahead, you can just.
Hi everyone, I'm Tia. So I'm one of the co-founders of Ma3kon. So Ma3kon means with you in Arabic for the people who might not speak the language. And it's a grassroots humanitarian initiative that we established just after the Beirut explosion. And it's led and co-founded by myself, by Laurent, who's also part of the Pro Bono Society, and Maghani Masri, who couldn't be here today, unfortunately. So we aim to provide essential products such as diapers and pads for vulnerable communities all over the country. So it ranges from migrant domestic worker to LGBT people to refugees, elderly people. And beyond that, we try to always deconstruct taboo subjects in the Arab world. So we tackle subjects such as with menstruation, education, and LGBT issues in general. And as of today, we have donated over 10,000 menstrual pads and 13,000 diapers all over the country. And we've been able to help over 450 families. So that's pretty much it about Ma3kon. Thank you for giving me the time to talk, and very excited to learn more.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so just a reminder, I'll put the donation link on the chat. So anyone who's willing to donate, we'd be very grateful. Something to keep in mind, because of the currency devaluation back home, even like £1-2 can make such a huge difference on the ground. So we'd be really, really grateful if anyone can donate anything. So I just send it on the chat right now. And that's it for us. It's time to hear the speaker. So we'll just move into the discussion now. So my first question is for Sinine, just to kind of, set the context of what we're talking about. Can you elaborate on the social, cultural, and structural barriers that the queer community faces in the region and the consequences of those barriers on the community as well?
Yeah, thanks, Laurent. So that's a huge question, right, to start with. And so what I'll do then is really focus on the social and cultural barriers and talk later maybe about the cultural ones, because it's a whole beast. And then let me start also prefacing my contribution by saying that I very much acknowledge that how my positionality right now as a diasporic person who's not living in Lebanon, who hasn't been living in Lebanon since 2019, means also that I can't claim to know what it's like right now for queer or trans folks to be living in Beirut. Of course, my family's still there, but I can only help reporting on what I've read from the networks and connections and friends I do have, right? So for those of you who don't know, here in 2019, thousands upon thousands of people in Lebanon took to the streets to protest against an economic recession that was back then very much in the making, right? And that was a very powerful, hopeful, unprecedented time for everyone, particularly for LGBTQIA plus people, right? Because so many people had come together, right? Uniting for, I would argue, the very first time against all members of the ruling elite, right? So the slogan of the Thawra was Kullun yani kullun, right? So all means all. So for the LGBT community, that meant participating with the hopes of finding this new kind of belonging and hoping for an inclusive Lebanon, right? So I would say that that hope was kind of put to shreds by a spiraling economic crisis. We had a global pandemic in 2020, and that was followed by a massive explosion in the heart of Beirut, in the port, which killed hundreds of people, at least the ones that we deemed worthy of counting as people, wounded thousands of others, and left hundreds of thousands of people homeless and displaced, right? Now, it's worth mentioning that the neighborhood surrounding that area, particularly around Ma3kon, first is inhabited by many cultural institutions, which says a lot later about what this means for the making and creation of art, but also that was frequented by queer and trans folks that heavily rely on an informal sector, right? So they'll work in restaurants, in bars, etc. Now, today, the lira, as Laurent just mentioned, has lost more than 90% of its value. And according to the Middle Eastern Eye and many others, now the war in Ukraine is only pushing the country into deeper crisis as global wheat and fuel prices are soaring, and the impact is really reverberating across markets. So what does this mean? So it means that we already had a context in which things were not okay, structurally speaking, for LGBTQIA plus people. That was only exacerbated by an economic crisis, the global pandemic and the explosion, right? So what this means is on a daily basis, so for those of you who don't know as well, in Lebanon, there's the article 534 of the Lebanese Penal Code, Good to know that it's a colonial relic inherited from the French Mandate. That article prohibits having sexual relations that are contradictory to the laws of nature, and that's punishable up to 1 year in prison, right, in Lebanon. Now, you couple this legal context with these crises with a sectarian regime in which personal laws are enshrined with sectarian laws, and a society that has been shown to care a lot. You can check, for example, studies by Charles Harab, which I would think would yield different results today, but at least when it was done, it showed that Lebanese society cares much more about the family unit than it does about sectarian affiliation. So you have all these factors coming together, and what this creates for queer and trans folks really is a hostile environment in which heteronormativity reigns, right? That is also an environment that is highly militarized, that very much excludes LGBTQIA plus people from the public sphere, from healthcare, from housing, the labor market, cultural production, and representation, right? So according to today, the Lebanese Medical Association for Sexual Health, or LEBMASH, people, LGBTQIA plus individuals continue to live with discrimination, decreased access to healthcare. They're less likely to be hired. Those who were hired lost their job. Now that the economic crisis is spiraling completely out of control, they've lost their homes after the explosion. Many of them have had to be in unsafe housing. Many of them have also, according to Daraj Media, for example, have had to live with completely unsupportive families, right? So they were kind of stuck at home under lockdown with family members to whom either they weren't out or they were and became very hostile, and they'd be subjected to gender-based violence, for example, some by their parents, some by their own partners as well, right? And so, for example, Mosaic, right, which provides social and psychological support, has reported an increase in new requests, mostly asking for residential and financial support from Lebanese people, but also Syrian, Iraqi, and Egyptian scholars, right? So these they became the kind of basics, right? People needed money and shelter, and they still do. According to LEBMASH, also elderly LGBTQIA plus individuals, they face more barriers to healthcare, right? Because they're living in isolation. They don't have access to health insurance the way that maybe other cis individuals do, right? They're also less likely to visit healthcare providers because they very well know, and they're not kind of illusion, they very well know how they might be treated, right? Or how stigma and discrimination are very much present, particularly in those medical spaces, I might add, right? So what all these structural and social and legal barriers, I think have, and there are many more, right? What I think they've done is really make us even more reliant on NGOs, on external funding, which I think also, of course, يعطيهم العافية for everyone, absolutely, but it also comes, right, at a political and a social and economic cost. Because what we're ending up doing then is continue to engage in the labor that should be by the hands of the state, right, and provide services that are public services at the end of the day, right? But what this has also meant is that communities have had to join hands together in all sorts of initiatives, and I'm sure Margot will have a lot more to say about initiatives and I would say kind of the relief funds that kind of came out of these intersecting crises, right? And so what this also has meant is that new forms of collaborations were really created, and a lot of creative initiatives as well, which I can maybe talk about more later on when I'm talking about culture.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It was really comprehensive. And you did mention I think it's Article 534 of the Penal Code, right, that criminalizes homosexual activities or same-sex intercourse between people. And that ties really well with my next question to Robert. So we talked about the socio-economic cultural barriers, but I think it's important also to talk about the legal barriers overall across the region. So maybe if you could, Robert, elaborate on the legal barriers that the queer community faces in those countries?
Yes, well, certainly the criminal laws are a big problem. That's generally the starting point for law reform. in most countries. If you have a criminal law, it stigmatizes entire communities, makes it hard to come out, and puts you at risk of blackmail, people forming police, etc. And it makes it impossible to discuss any other form of discrimination, because if you're a criminal, then of course it's justifiable to discriminate against you. You're a threat to society. So yeah, I mean, just by way of comparison, if you look at the former British Empire, same-sex sexual activity, or at least between men, many times also between women, was a criminal offense in almost everywhere as of 1960. So that means UK, Ireland, Malta, Cyprus in Europe, Canada, all 50 US states, the whole of Australia, New Zealand, etc. So there's been a long process of chipping away at these laws. Now, if we look at the MENA countries, we have, let's see, 13 that definitely criminalize out of 18, 2 that are somewhat uncertain. I was looking at ILGA's ILGA World state-sponsored homophobia report, and they classify Egypt and Iraq as de facto legal, which is a bit ambiguous. I'm not sure what they mean about that. So yeah, people have trouble with classifying Egypt and Iraq. The 2 countries where same-sex sexual activity is definitely legal are Bahrain and Jordan, and then in the territory of Israel, Palestine, you have, it appears a criminal law in Gaza, but not in Israel and the West Bank. So overall, the general picture is criminalization. And so I'd say should be the focus of campaigns. I was in Montreal in 2017. There was a conference on LGBT rights in Francophone countries, and they had activists from Morocco, Algeria, etc., and Tunisia, and they were talking about their criminal laws. So yeah, I would suspect that the 2 countries where reform would be most likely to happen soon would be Lebanon, apart from the other national challenges, and Tunisia. In fact, there was a report of the president on a variety of human rights issues, and one of the issues where reform was recommended was the criminal law on same-sex sexual activity. So if those reforms could take place, they would then help neighboring countries, because in changing the law, the most influential example is your neighbors. So the fact that the Supreme Court of India issued a decision on same-sex sexual activity in 2018 might or might not be considered relevant or of interest, but the fact that the country next door has done it would carry a lot of weight. So yeah, I think that's enough for this question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tia, you can take over with the next 2 questions.
All right, great. So my next question goes out to Margot. So we're very glad to have you here, because we've seen how much of a trailblazer Helem has been in terms of LGBT rights in Lebanon and also in the wider region. So the question is, since Helem is the first LGBTQ NGO in the Arab world, could you maybe provide us with a background of the organization and the type of work that you engage in Lebanon, but also within the region?
Yes, thank you. Well, Helem was officially established in Beirut in 2001. but it did not fall from the sky. And communities existed before safe spaces like the one that was established at Helem was here. They organically used to come together and informally discuss several topics related to the general context, mainly legal, social, and cultural. And so the World Wide Web as well allowed the LGBTQ community to use online platforms to be able to connect with each other, conversate about such topics, and maybe plan and engage with each other for activism purposes, or just, to be able to be free in that zone. So this being said, in 2001, a group of people came together and founded this organization, and a larger group of people who used to meet several times a month supported its efforts. Now, I can speak about Helem's background for hours because it's linked to a lot of incidents, violent incidents, attacks on human rights violations that used to happen before. And it really involved a lot of organizations in the civil society that exist today that were either birthed by this organization or that, were able to start as organic groups from there. But instead, I would tell you how it actually developed, because its mission didn't really change since then. So it just developed into 3 different pillars. So we have the first one, which is the protection and service provision. It started, of course, by providing legal aid and assistance to individuals who were prone to being arrested, who were getting arrested, or who were attacked from an SGBV perspective. Today, توسع أكتر يعني its services department got really expanded into providing other sorts of services as well. So its case management grew. It's now also providing counseling for diverse SOGIESC related matters in the asylum. It provides mental health support, emergency response, and all sorts of services related to health for all the reasons that Sinine mentioned as well in her talk. The second component, the second pillar, is the community building and mobilization pillar, which is extremely important. So basically, from before, what used to happen is that people would gather, form identity and interest clubs and committees who would basically work on their own ideas and projects, whether to produce knowledge or to raise awareness or to advocate for LGBTQ rights through several sorts of campaigns. All of it, of course, to fight transphobia, biphobia, and acquire more justice. It now has a community center space where individuals can bond, heal, and build power and build capacity to do that. Its third component is advocacy and research, which the 2 first pillars feed into. Within the wider region, Helem connects and collaborates and supports indirectly other organizations in the countries. So it does not provide direct services, but it meets very often to discuss common challenges, to reflect together on what can be collectively done. So there are a lot of coalitions and networks that exist in the MENA region, which we're part of, and from which we learn a lot. Voila.
All right, thank you so much for that. I mean, it was great to hear about all your different pillars and what you've been doing for the past few years. So to move on to the next question, it's for Sinine. So you've obviously built a very large presence online through your artwork and your activism. And I think a lot of people tend to forget about the importance of the intersection between art and politics and social issues, which is such a shame because I feel like your work has resonated with a lot of people in Lebanon, the diaspora, and even people all over the world. So as a storyteller and an illustrator, what would you say is the role of art in dismantling oppressive structures and destigmatizing LGBTQ plus experiences? And if you could maybe even elaborate on your own work in various digital spaces.
Thank you, Tia. So, I mean, I think, so again, for those of you who don't know, right, I think it's important to contextualize the context within which I maybe tell those stories, right, and what kind of motivates me to do that. But it's very hard to say in general what the role of art is, right? So people have different approaches, different visions, different mediums, and they kind of use their aesthetics for different purposes. And it depends on their funds and their structures, and because that also motivates what kind of art you produce, right? So I think that, in Lebanon, queer and trans people have always had to deal with aesthetic and cultural erasure, right? And misrepresentation. So when I was growing up, as I'm sure many of you have also experienced that, when I was growing up, I'm watching LBC or MTV or Télé Lumière. I watched those local sitcoms and those comedy shows and those news outlets, and the figure of the queer was this very murky figure, right? So it would either come up as a testimony that we have had to conceal, right? So we'll blur the face of the person, or kind of alter their voices, and this kind of adds to the murkiness of the whole thing. And this person is in danger, but also endangering society. So you either have this trope, or you have the trope of the overly flamboyant, deviant being, right? So that's exemplified by characters like Fadia Shreya, for example, that of course it's played by a cis straight man, right? That will either fetishize queer life, queer bodies, trans bodies, for example, right? Or ridicule them. So these are kind of the tropes that we kind of grew up with, and this is what existed. These were our stories, really, that were written by other people, performed by other people. Of course, things changed later on, right? But I mean, to me, it was coming out of this context. And so in 2018, right, and mind you, the literature that I was exposed to, that in my education, in my circles, was also Western literature. So I would mostly read about European characters or American characters, but none of those struggles really represented me. And I had no book on my shelf or in school that would talk about queer issues, for example, in Arabic, right? And again, none of these didn't exist. They were just not visible or highly published, right? And so in 2018, I had cut my hair and became very short. And so what this did to me was completely alter my interactions with people in the public sphere, right? So when I would go to the notary's office or the airport or to whatever, to like a hotel or something with my partner for a weekend getaway, my interactions with people completely changed, right? Because I was suddenly registering as queer. And it's within this context and with that experience in mind that I decided to create Beirut by Dyke, which features comics about what it was like for me to inhabit public space in a queer body, right? As a gender non-conforming person. And so to me, really what this allows me to do is, let me share my screen and just give those of you who maybe don't know the page, just a bit of a sense of what I'm talking about. There we go. And so what I do is I through comics and photography, multimedia, I really rely on comics to kind of re-own those narratives and retell my own stories as I have experienced them, as they have affected me. And so what this allows me to do really is and here, you know, thinking about the role of art or what this has done to me, it has given me new ways, maybe, of representing new ways of living, of loving, of resisting, of refusing, accepting, living, or even dying, right? And to imagine what would those possibilities look like? What would it mean for us to, for example, be able to simmer in this post-sex connection with windows that are wide open in the heart of Shaitawa and Ashrafiyya in Beirut, right? And so art really, I think the beautiful thing about it is that, you know, particularly when we are inhabiting geographically or not, right? In my head, I'm still living in Beirut, right? On some level, inhabiting those spaces that are hostile to us in many ways, it allows us to reimagine them, literally retrace them. And in doing that, creating new possibilities, right? About what our relationships or our desires or love or collaborations could look like, right? So, for example, during the Beirut explosion, what I also did was find these ethnographic notes, really, as I view them, that were dropped by some friends and colleagues on Facebook around what it was like to survive normalcy, for example, after the Beirut explosion. And this is kind of like one of them, right? Or when that famous heartbeat showed up under the rubble of Beirut, 1 month following the explosion, the Chilean rescue team came in and said, you know, we might have someone who's, you know, kind of still alive under that rubble. And what kind of, what this meant to other people to have this kind of like hope, right? And so for me, one sec. And if you want, by the way, there are captions that are associated with these images. So do feel free to head to the page if you would like to know the stories behind each of them, right? So they'll include like a pretty hefty textual component. And so basically it has, I think, art in a way, it has given an outlet for many communities to create, curate art and take back that space that has been taken from them, right? We suffer from a huge lack of the ability to access public spaces and use them or reimagine them. And I think that art, particularly when it came to art that is being created and circulated on digital platforms, allowed people to find one another or to recreate their own realities. And so as a storyteller, I feel like I'm always trying to strike that balance between realistically reporting on my life and my daily challenges as a gender nonconforming person, now that I sport, and imagining what other possibilities of inhabiting my own body could look like. So I could elaborate more in the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, that was amazing. Thank you so much for that. And I also, by the way, for everyone, I put all the Instagram accounts, the relevant ones in the chat. So Sinine's and Helem and also Ma3kon. So if you want to give a follow, you can check the work of each person on their account. But yeah, Sinine, thank you so much for that. So my next question, before going to Robert, I have a quick question for Margot. So you did mention the importance, Sinine, of like public spaces, right? And the fact that queer communities lack these public spaces, specifically after the explosion when they were destroyed and all of that. And I know, Margot, you mentioned the importance of creating these safe spaces for communities. But I guess my question would be, you know, you mentioned about operating a queer NGO in Lebanon. What have been the most significant challenges in that? Because it's a pretty hostile environment. You briefly touched upon acts of aggression and violence against people who were working at Helem. And also more practically, how were you able as an organization to overcome and kind of navigate this environment that's very hostile towards queer people?
Thanks. So basically the acts of violence is not specifically only towards NGO workers or individuals who volunteer work at Helem. It's the overall, what I meant is the overall community living in Lebanon, or LGBTQI individuals who live in Lebanon. Now all of you mentioned how hostile the environment is vis-a-vis the community, which also means, بكثير محلات it's also violent and does not necessarily tolerate NGOs who specifically work with the community as well. So even though في علم وخبر, so about Helem, in many places, hosting events within the community center or outside the community center still pose threats on the community, and it's still happening that places are raided or stopped by the authorities. And so that's somewhat critical. We encounter this by collaborating with a lot of other organizations. One of them, for example, is Legal Agenda, who's always on call, who always supports us with our safety plans, and who's always open for consultation. Knowing our rights is also of major help as well. So this is how we can counter such attacks. The second challenge, based on what I just said as well, is the lack of engagement and collaboration from the public sector and the government. So we try to do, what we try to do is to engage them publicly as much as possible, because under the public eye, and they have less room to escape, and they're somewhat forced to tackle those topics, although the outcomes are not necessarily positive, or little action is taken after that, but still. And so in our advocacy plans, we also collaborate with multiple other organizations so that we can, map out the stakeholders on multiple levels, not just governmental or public, but also, for example, let's say religious or social, other cultural stakeholders who can help us in this fight. So it's a collaborative work. And it's a little bit difficult because many people try to label, SOGIASC matters or LGBTQ individuals, as if those are matters, those are issues that is only the matter of this community, which is not true. This is the same thing for women. For the women movement, the women rights and the women cause is labeled women issues. No, actually, it's everybody's issues, and we should start thinking that way, because otherwise, it will take more time to have more impact, and for us to, acquire justice. So this is two. Third, well, it's really geographical. So Helem and many other NGOs working on LGBTQ issues are LGBTQI matters and rights are, located in Beirut or Bidawahi Beirut, so in the close Mount Lebanon districts, which makes it very difficult for people living in farthest governorates to learn about the existing services and the existing safe spaces. And it's even more difficult for them to access those spaces and services now with the multi-layered crisis and complete free fall. What we're trying to do now is to, promote more those services that we have and the spaces that we have. We also collaborate with more organizations that are not specific to queer individuals, so that we can establish a referral pathway in order for them to have access to us. And a lot of our campaigns as well, for example, in our upcoming campaign, we conducted social experiments in multiple governorates for the first time outside of Beirut and Mount Lebanon, so including Trablus, Jbel, Ljnoub, so a lot of other governorates. I would say also the lack of inclusive services and friendly, knowledgeable experts in Lebanon is a huge challenge. I will expand a little bit more on that later. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to train as much as possible other organizations in the civil society world and experts in order to be able to do that. And we're training youth as well in universities on know your rights, SOGIASC, how to argue providing them with myth-busting techniques and arguments so that this debate can start, in the educational world or sphere. So yeah. That's it in a nutshell.
I mean, thank you so much for that. It's true. I mean, that's why I think we really were so focused on getting an NGO representative, because we wanted to know like the realities and beyond the theory, how it operates. But you did mention a bit about like the needs of what should happen in order for things to change. And again, that ties to my question to Robert now about legal reform. So, I mean, Robert, we did talk about, how reform usually operate in different countries. And should you go to the courts? Should you go to the legislature? Should you need a cultural revolution before a broad legal reform happens? So I was wondering, because you did touch upon it a bit, but could you elaborate on specifically queer legal reform in different parts of the world, and whether there's something to be learned about to apply in the MENA as well?
Yes. Just before I do that, I'd just like to mention briefly my connections with Lebanon. So here's my souvenir from, oops, can you see it? That was from Montreal, actually, the conference I mentioned. But prior to that, in 2006, I was co-president of LGBT Human Rights Conference in Montreal as part of the World Out Games. And we had a plenary session with a speaker from Lebanon. And this was end of July 2006. So Israel's attack on Lebanon had begun. And so our speaker could not travel. The airport runway had been bombed. There were no ferries, etc. But we managed to get a video statement and broadcast it at the conference. So we were not going to be defeated. And then actually earlier that year, in May 2006, I had the great pleasure of visiting Beirut, and I gave a talk at the Helem office. I knew Georges Azi at the time. I don't know if he's still involved. Right, so law reform. Well, legislature or court, important thing to remember is they're not mutually exclusive. You can be lobbying politicians, having draft bills, and at the same time having court cases. And the two can influence each other. So a positive court decision can influence the legislature, development in the legislature can influence the courts. So it's important not to limit your initiatives. Now, in terms of order of issues, as I said, you generally start with the criminal law. Once it's reformed, it's easier for some individuals to be open. So I suppose the long-term goal is openness. So if you look at the statements of or speeches of Harvey Milk, the openly gay member of San Francisco City Council, who was assassinated in 1978 or so, his message was come out, come out, come out, come out. That is how you change the society. And you can start small with your friends, when you're ready, if it's possible, family members, but it's all about visibility, especially in the media, discussion, and all of that paves the way for law reform. So first stage, criminal law. Second stage is usually an anti-discrimination law applying to employment and other areas. And that helps more people to come out again. Now, I had the experience of being a lawyer in the Milbank law firm in New York at the time when there was no anti-discrimination protection. So in 1985, I decided to come out to my boss, and I asked him if I could do pro bono legal work for lesbian and gay and HIV organizations in New York. And he was very supportive, and it all went very well. But at the time, I had no legal protection, and they could have dismissed me, but I took the risk. The next year, 1986, they did pass a law in New York City. They added sexual orientation to their anti-discrimination law. So that tends to be the next stage. Now, what would complicate things in MENA countries is whether or not there is an anti-discrimination law to amend. For example, in India, there isn't a general one. There's some piecemeal laws, but there isn't one where you just need a small amendment. So that makes, this is actually the case in many countries. So, because you cannot ask for the first protection against discrimination to be based on sexual orientation and gender identity. People will say, well, what about sex? What about race? What about disability, religion, etc.? So you need comprehensive legal protection. So that's something to investigate. And if there is no law, in a way that's an advantage, because you can present a bill with comprehensive protection and the spotlight will not be on the LGBT issues necessarily. So that's stage 2, which then permits more openness when people feel I can come out and I'll have legal protection if in my employment, in housing, etc. And then stage 3 is really the family law issues. So when people feel protected, able to be open, the next stage is for them to say, and I'd like you to meet my partner. So in Canada, when the anti-discrimination legislation was amended, there were very few cases of dismissal from employment. All of the cases in the courts were about employment benefits for a same-sex partner, dental plan benefits, all kinds of benefits. So that's when you get to that stage, then you can start talking about family law and recognizing same-sex couples, adoption rights, et cetera, So, but I'd say that takes time because you have to get the society used to the idea of openly LGBT individuals before they're ready to take on the couples. So if you look at the history in the UK, if we look at the time periods, reforming the criminal laws, at least the blanket prohibitions, was completed in 1981 with Northern Ireland as a result of the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. When did we get an anti-discrimination law? 2003. So that's 22 years later. And that was as a result of a European Union directive. Now, perhaps surprisingly, the couple recognition came very quickly the year after, 2004 civil partnership law. So because sometimes the society is ready for reform, it can happen quite quickly, but sometimes there can be gaps. So let's take what would be another example. Let's take Quebec, province of Quebec in Canada, anti-discrimination law 1977, law on couples 2002. So that's 25 years. So the periods can vary in different countries, but those. So and this is where I think you have to be realistic about what's possible in your country. If you have a criminal law, it'll be hard to do anything else. If you don't have the criminal law, it's better to focus on the anti-discrimination law for individuals. Now, there's a lot of pressure. No, we want same-sex marriage immediately, just like various other countries, but generally it's not politically realistic. And it's also not logical because the situation in the US was very strange. In 2015, same-sex couples got the right to marry from the Supreme Court in all 50 states. But in many states, there was no anti-discrimination protection. So you could get married on Saturday and then Monday go to work and tell everyone how happy you are and be dismissed, lose your job. So that is now, that anomaly has been removed by a second US Supreme Court decision in 2020, which interpreted the law on sex discrimination as also applying to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So yeah, so you have to be realistic and think about what the society is ready for. And just one final note, the reason I went to Beirut in May 2006 was to visit Zaid Al-Ali, King's College London graduate of the English Law and French Law program in 1999. And he now lives in Tunis. He married a woman from Beirut, and he's published 2 books. The most recent one, 2021, is called Arab Constitutionalism. Yeah. So yeah, he was probably my first connection to the Arab world. His parents are from Iraq. Yeah. And it happened at King's. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Tia.
All right, thank you so much. So the next question is for Sinine. So I know you already mentioned this at the beginning as we were talking about the revolution and all of that. So just as a quick recap, when the revolution happened in Lebanon in 2019, there were a lot of demands around anti-corruption and anti-sectarianism and all of that. But at the same time, we had a group of people who were advocating for their rights. So let's say women's rights and LGBT rights and all of that. So could you elaborate on what place LGBTQ rights occupied within the 2019 uprising? And more specifically, how would you respond to this discourse around, well, this is not a priority right now, we should leave LGBT issues for later because there are more pressing issues? Like, we see this narrative a lot. More recently, we had an Instagram comment on our page saying exactly that. So do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Tia. So I think, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask me this is the very recent episode where Kawkab Zahal, one of the prominent drag queens, was hosted on Malik Maktab Ahmar Bil Khat Al Arid, which is a local TV show about social issue. And in the episode, Malik asks Kawkab Zahal, the country is struggling to keep its most basic rights right now. What makes you think that the country is ready to accept sexual rights, right? And I think that Zahal gave the most perfect answer that you could give to such question, answering that, would you like me to sleep with women until I have my electricity back? Right. And so I think women, queer and trans folks in Lebanon and other countries as well have always been told to wait their turn, right? That and that turn never seems to actually come, right? Even when we thought that we were in crisis in the past decade, that turn never seems to come, right? Because it always seems to get worse, and it never seems to be the realistic context in which we could technically advocate for our rights, right? I think that feminists have been putting forward an intersectional discourse, I would argue, since the birth of Nasawiya and later Damme and spaces like Space 27, for example, right? Alternative feminist spaces have been doing this for a long time. So if you look at the slogans that were used, for example, and before that even, but specifically in the International Women's Day March of 2019, which was العدالة الاقتصادية قضية نسوية. So in English, economic justice is a feminist issue, right? So slogans about, you would see on the streets, slogans about the right for abortion or going against the kafala system that holds migrant workers under the patronage of their sponsors, right? You'd see women advocating for trans rights, gender-based violence, mental health issues as well, right? So all of this did exist before the 2019 protests. The difference is, I think, that in 2019, especially for queer and trans folks, those chants became much more visible and they became much louder, right? And so, because before it was very easy, as Margot mentioned, to silence any notion that had to do with sexuality as being this Western imported concept, right? And so this is where it becomes also a very tricky business to say that it is important that we increase visibility in order to then advocate for legal reform. Because whose visibility exactly are we talking about here, right? And I'm definitely one of them in my page as well, right? And so who are the people who can afford to be visible, who perhaps are diasporic, who perhaps have financial independence or financial grounding or resources and connections, or who have the NGO language to apply for funds in the first place, and who are the people who bear the brunt of that visibility are people who are at the other end of those raids or of those incarcerations or you know, incarcerations as well, right? Who get stopped at checkpoints or sexually harassed or assaulted, etc., or even killed, right? Those are the people that we kind of most of the times in our discourses also leave them out, right? And so I think what the uprisings did in 2018 was kind of like expand this already existing call to make and make it kind of like much more visible, but also particularly, I would say, safe, right? This is the very first time, and mind you, I'm watching it, you know, through my cell phone, right? But I'm seeing those videos and I'm hearing those chants, and you can very well see how it was the very first time where I heard those chants against transphobia, against biphobia, against what have you, homophobia, being chanted not just by our kind of like small little circles, but by thousands of other people as well, right? And so, and it was also the first time that you would see that there was kind of this normalization of the shaming of the use of discriminatory language, right? So words like kiss or lute, right? Were very much shamed by the public. So you very much saw people responding to, so when someone in the public sphere would use those words, right? You would see the reaction by people saying, you know, kisse mishum sebbe, my cunt is not a swear word, right? Or what was it? Thawrit luwat, right? So this is a revolution of gays. So there was a kind of reclaiming of that language. And I think people for the first time, as Rasha Yunus reports, by the way, for the Human Rights Watch, it was the first time that people felt safe enough to stay out late, to be in those, in part of that huge collective. And that, I think, I can only imagine how empowering that was to be able to see words like suhakiye or thawrat luwat, for example, being sprayed all over those walls in Martyrs Square, right? So I think that in Lebanon, especially those intersectional discourses and agendas are particularly important to continue, right? Advocating for, because of the way in which the legal, social, urban, and political structures of the entire system are set up, right? And how they kind of like depend on each other and feed onto one another, right? So as Maya Mekdashi argues, for example, in her forthcoming book, Sectarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon, our personal status laws are enshrined with sectarian laws, right? So you can't advocate for queer, trans, non-binary rights without also looking at how the law makes those gendered and racial differentiations between bodies, right, that come into effect and to practice in the everyday, right? And govern the way in which we can or cannot ask for citizenship and what that means. So I don't want to be part, let's say, of a discourse that will fight for women's rights to give her children the Lebanese citizenship, while a kafala system or labor law that are still in effect can discriminate against and incarcerate bodies that are deemed foreign or not worthy of labor laws or citizenship, right? And that's why it is very, very hard to go against the system in Lebanon, because you're not going against one law, right? You are going against an entire system, an entire structure that's legal, that's religious, and that entails legal and religious and political bodies whose authorities depend on one another and feed off of one another. So yeah.
All right, thank you so much for that. I honestly completely agree with that discourse, because I feel like when the Thawra happened, it was the first time we actually saw people who felt safe, like you said. And I really hope that this discourse can come back, because I feel like it's been, with everything going on, not as present. So moving on to the next question. This one is for Margot. So it's a two-part question. So firstly, I wanted to ask, what would you say is the role of NGOs in regards to LGBTQ liberation in the MENA region? And as a follow-up, I know that also many people are critical, and rightfully so, about foreign humanitarian missions getting involved, especially given the history of colonialism and occupation. So what can you say, if anything, about the relationship between grassroots movement and outsider interventions?
Okay. So in regards to the first part of the question, which is what in my opinion is the role of NGOs in regards to the LGBTQ movement in Lebanon. Well, I think this question each different NGO might have, or each different person might have a different answer to it. But I would say that first of all, it's important for NGOs to know what is the role that they want to play in this fight, and be very concise and clear about it, so that people's expectations are right about this NGO, and at the same time, this allows them to acknowledge the presence and existence of other key actors in this fight, and therefore it might help them as well, recognize that they cannot operate independently if they really want to reach higher impact in regards to this. And so, in conclusion, for this point, I would say that every NGO has a role to play in the inclusion of LGBTQ individuals in society, Lebanon and in the MENA region and internationally. So they should be inclusive in their practices, but as well, they should be aware that the system of humanitarian support and protection and services is not the same for all the communities that exist in Lebanon. And I would give just a very brief example. In Lebanon, there is no shelter for trans women, for example, but there are shelters for women. And there are organizations that work on that. So it's important for the community to be included in such services. So that's just an example. Now, another role that NGOs play in that particular sense is also to support and capacitate those actors. So this can be done through training sessions, this could be done through collective planning and whatnot. Building bridges with the alternatives and initiatives that are local is as well very important, as well as regional. Evolving with the community and the context in which we exist is also very mandatory. Otherwise, it won't be serving the population that it aims to serve accordingly. And awareness and knowledge production is as well very important. Working on accessibility in that sense is very important as well. Terminologies change all the time. It's very important to archive and document people's stories and then use them for advocacy. So NGOs who work on documenting the human rights violations and providing services to those people accordingly, in my opinion, these are a lot of resources that can be collectively used to pressure the government, the public institutions, and society to evolve. So that's in regard to the first part. Now, regarding, sorry, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Yeah, of course. So I was saying that a lot of people are critical about humanitarian missions and intervention from abroad, specifically from Western countries that help NGOs and grassroots movement in Lebanon or in the MENA region. So would you say anything about the relationship between these grassroots movements and the outsider interventions and the kind of interplay between that?
Yeah, we hear more and more about local initiatives that are inclusive towards LGBTQ individuals and local organizations that come out. However, these organizations, as far as I know, are not necessarily able to fund other organizations. Very often they also rely on different source of income, whether from international organizations or the diaspora living abroad, in order to exist and be able to fulfill their mission. So whenever there are such initiatives or such organizations that exist in Lebanon, of course this is the first thing that, for example, Helem would consider. But I don't know of any institution that does that. And as I said earlier, there's no engagement from the different public sector that exists, nor the government, and no support whatsoever. So very often, yes, we have to turn to international funding. However, international funding or foreign funding, for example, does not dictate the way NGOs work, or NGOs can choose how to do that. So, for example, in the case of Helem, we have our own policies. We are also very picky when it comes to funding because, a lot of it's political at the end of the day as well. And very often as well, the information does not go back to them. So there are reports that are, for example, sent, but that do not disclose individuals' confidentiality. It limits technically the donor from So the donor does not design the intervention. It does not design the program and the projects, but we do report on it so that people know where this money is going. So this is in regards to that in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for that. So yeah, we're moving on to our last question, and it's for Robert. And during that discussion, we talked a lot about what should be done, but we haven't talked about the other side of the coin when people usually use queer issues as an instrument for political or various agendas. So I'm referring to specifically Israeli pinkwashing policies in the MENA and how that played out in the whole Palestinian liberation movement. Yeah, so this is a three-parter, three small questions. So could you first explain what is pinkwashing for people who don't know? What purpose does it serve in the grand scheme of things? And what are truly the realities of queer people in the territory compared to the messaging that is being put out from Israel or other countries engaging in that type of policy?
Okay, just before I answer the questions, I just wanted to say something about NGOs versus international interventions. That's something to be debated in every country, and different conclusions will be reached. So I've attended Pride events in Eastern Europe, Riga, Vilnius, Bucharest, Tokyo, Rainbow Pride, etc. And what's quite noticeable is there are lots of embassies marching, embassy staff marching in solidarity, embassies of other countries, and lots of corporate delegations, Google, Amazon, whatever, Yahoo. So that's one way of trying to change the society. But I also attended Delhi Queer Pride in 2017, and they had a strict policy of no corporate participation and no foreign embassies. And I think that's a decision they've taken in India. that they don't want people making the argument that this is something foreign. That applied also to their court case, which started in 2001 and finished successfully in 2018, so 17 years. You have to be patient. I first went to India in 2006, and I asked them, would you like a third party intervention, or in the US it's called amicus curiae brief, friend of the court brief, from international organizations in the case, making arguments. And they said, thank you very much, but no, because that would just support the argument this is something foreign. So yeah, something to be considered in every country. Now, turning to pinkwashing, it's basically trying to use Israel's relatively better record on LGBT issues to excuse its massive racial discrimination against Palestinians. And I have come across this many times. I know a gay professor in France who refuses to boycott Israel. I urged him to, asked him if he could organize an event at his university discussing boycott. And he's basically, his answer is no. Israel's gay friendly, I can't boycott them. And I was once handing out leaflets, boycott Israel, in the London Pride Parade, and two probably Jewish men came up to me and said, what are you doing? If you went to an Arab country, they would kill you. So therefore I should support Israel was their message. So I wrote a draft book chapter on this topic. Half of it was on this topic. And the editor of the book rejected it, said it was anti-Semitic because it was talking about apartheid in Israel. So eventually I hope to publish it in my own book. But thinking about this question, I came up with three reasons basically why Israel's record on LGBT issues, having a big pride event in Tel Aviv is all completely irrelevant. So number one, Israel's record is relatively modest. There is no law in Israel that allows a same-sex couple to register their relationship. There's lots of legal recognition for cohabiting same-sex couples, which is good, but you cannot register your relationship in the country. Now, nearly 2/3 of European countries have such a law. So, and in fact, 80% of the larger Western European countries have marriage for same-sex couples, most recently Switzerland. So Israel is not a leader in this area. In fact, I asked a Jewish Israeli law professor to confirm that the last positive law passed by the Knesset was in 1992. An anti-discrimination law, and he said yes, they've done nothing since then. So first, yeah, modest records. Second, the LGBT friendliness disappears when it applies to Palestinians. So one example, they've just renewed the law on sponsoring a spouse for immigration from the West Bank or Gaza. So yes, Israel has immigration rights for same-sex partners. That's good, but not if the same-sex partner lives in the West Bank or Gaza. Then it's prohibited. So that's something that's not mentioned when they're promoting Tel Aviv Pride, which I've seen promoted in Helsinki and Tokyo, etc. In New York, the 50th anniversary of Stonewall Parade, big float for Tel Aviv Pride. None of these details are mentioned. And my third argument is essentially that a country's human rights record is like a bank balance. So you have credits and you have debits. And so, yes, Israel deserves some credit for its progress on LGBT issues, but In the terms of its overall human rights record, Israel is bankrupt because there's an enormous debit for the racial discrimination against Palestinians. So for me, pinkwashing doesn't work. So the idea is to portray Israel as a liberal democracy. The test of liberal democracy is, are you LGBT friendly? Do you have a big pride parade? And that excuses everything. I just reject that completely. And I suppose my final point and the conclusion of my thinking in this area is that I take the exact opposite position. Not only do I not support Israel because it's LGBT friendly, I think if we want to see more improvements in the area of LGBT rights across the MENA countries and in Muslim majority countries, to have credibility, we have to condemn racial discrimination against Palestinians by Israel. Because why should any country listen to us? And I would say this would be true of women's rights, etc. So if you really destroy your credibility, if you say, yes, equality for women, equality for LGBTs, and you should do this, but not for Palestinians, then why should anyone listen to anything you have to say? So, yeah, so that's, oh, and I just say what I tried to do to counteract pinkwashing. Back in 2016, I heard that an activist in France had been arrested for wearing a t-shirt. So I quickly went to the website and ordered the same t-shirt. If you can see it. Yeah. So, and I tried to wear it at all Pride events, just especially if there's a Tel Aviv Pride booth, etc. So, and I was at Tokyo Rainbow Pride in 2018, and I had left my t-shirt at home, which was very distressing. But I witnessed some confrontations at the Israeli embassy booth at the Pride Festival. So yeah, there is this pinkwashing and promotion, and we have to be aware of it and stand up to it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thank you so much for shedding the light on that. I feel like, I mean, I have a personal experience with that. I experienced someone telling to someone else, if you want to be gay, just go to Israel, don't stay in Lebanon. So, and that's a Lebanese person who said that. So I think that tells a lot about the views that are so embedded in these regions. But yeah, thank you so much for that intervention. Okay, so I mean, this is the end of the panel officially. So we do have a 10-minute Q&A for anyone who has a question. You can just like leave it on the chat. But if not, yeah, I'm not sure what, I'm not sure where Robert went, but okay, just a minute. Hello.
Hello, sorry, I just had to let someone into my flat. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries at all. I was just saying this is the end of the event officially. So unless people have questions in the chat, or if any one of the speaker would like to add any final thought, I think we could just call it a night and everyone can enjoy their night. So
can I just say something?
Yeah, of course.
I'm a real optimist in this area. And I know that huge patience is required and different societies are going to change at different rates, etc. But in the long term, there are same-sex couples all over the world, in every country. And what the challenge for families when people come out is basically saying to family members, do you want me to be happy? do you want me to enter into a traditional opposite sex marriage that will make me unhappy and make my spouse unhappy? Or do you want me to be happy? And I think that is basically our secret weapon. And that's what will change the world. So I gave a lecture for the University of Hong Kong and concluded with this point. And I had videos, trailers from 2 Bollywood films. There's one about a lesbian woman escaping marriage to a man. That was 2019. There's a 2021 where there are 2 men in the film and presented very in a very sympathetic light. And 2022, there's now one about a marriage of convenience in Delhi, I believe. A gay police officer finds a lesbian woman to marry to please their families. And I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but I hear it's very good. I hope to see it. And so that's what you need everywhere in every country. So when you can get, especially get MENA television programs, films, talking about these issues, that will pave the way for change.
Yep, thank you. Margot or Sinine, if you have anything to add.
I mean, I would just really recommend Maya Mikdashi's forthcoming book on sectarianism, right? Sovereignty and the state in Lebanon, for really for an in-depth analysis, I would say, of legal cases that are coming out of the Lebanese context itself. So I would really recommend it. I'm trying to find the link right now. And of course I can't. So I don't know if Margot wants to say something in the meantime. There we go.
Hey, yeah. So I would just say that basically, I'm also very optimistic about this, and I agree with what Robert was saying. We constantly, the visibility and breaking taboos by encouraging conversations that are open to the general public, that happen on the media, that happen in online platforms, that happen in real time, in real space, can really empower those conversations, can really empower the community to take those conversations and be able to open them with their close environment and in places where they generally don't necessarily talk about it. So I think that's very important to point out as well.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So before everyone leaves and we just finish this event, just want to remind everyone that the donation link is on the chat. We'd really appreciate any donation. So I hope this talk was able to illustrate how bad the situation is. So I feel like you know, a lot of NGOs, Ma3kon or Helem, or any support for any grassroots initiative is really helpful on the ground. But other than that, thank you so much for joining. Thank you to the speakers for your time. It was really, really insightful. And we have a recording. So Sinine, you did record. So thank you for that. And we'll post snippets on various social media platforms. And if you want a recording as well, you can request it. Reach out to either Pro Bono Society or Ma3kon, and we'll provide a link for the recording. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laurent. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.